In this module, we're going to dive into the wonderful world of APIs, application programming interfaces, and learn what an API is and where we can access its documentation. All of this is for your DevOps Engineer Level 4 apprenticeship and looking at Knowledge Area K17, what is an API? Now, the first thing is to understand what an API is. It's all well and good saying an application programming interface, but what exactly do we mean by that? So the best way to understand what an API is to use one. So come on, let's go out and find an API and how to use it. Now, you have been tasked with something that might seem relatively straightforward, to display the temperature. And we want the temperature for the next 7 days. So, of course, we might think our first task is going to be display the temperature. However, it's not going to be our first task. Before we can display the temperature, we need to know where we are. So we want to get our location. But to get our location, we're going to need to know the public IP address of the system that we are using. So instead of using one API, we're going to need to use 3 APIs. But this also illustrates the importance of mapping out what you need to do before you start writing any code. So we don't need to get the IP address of the system we are using. That's likely to be a private internal address. To get our location, we need to find out the public IP address of the router that we are using. To be able to get your external or public IP address, we can use ifconfig.me. We can go to the web page and it kind of gives you the documentation as well. So there isn't separate documentation for this. When we go out and visit it, if we just use ifconfig.me, we would be returning the IP address. But we could also get this explicitly by using /IP. And our documentation is shown really with the command line interface. So ifconfig.me by itself is going to return just the IP address in the same way as we use /IP. If we wanted the user agent, we would put in /UA and so forth with the documentation. So once we've understood what we want, and all we want is the public IP address that we are using to access the API, we can then go through and turn our attention to using Python. We'll begin, though, by testing our hypotheses about ifconfig.me. So if we just use ifconfig.me by itself, using the curl command, which is going to send a request, we get the IP address coming back, just in the same way as if we use /IP. So, of course, the shortest way is just to use ifconfig.me. If we look at the user agent, so /UA, of course, we're using curl, so we're seeing that being returned. And if we looked at using /all to the API, then we're getting all of the populated fields coming back. So we need to implement this within our script, and it's our first stage. So I have a script called s1.py, just for a simple name. If we go through and take a look inside of the script, instead of using curl, we'll be using the requests module. So we start off with import requests. This is typically used when accessing APIs. We can go through and see that we've defined a function, get public IP address, and we have a try and accept block. In the try, we're going through then and making sure that we can get a response from ifconfig.me. Remember, we're just using the URL without the option /IP because we know that returns just the IP address. We look for any HTTP error coming back in our raise for status. But if everything is okay, we can then return the response.txt. The strip method is just making sure that we remove any leading and trailing white space. For any exception, we manage that exception by printing out the error message. Our main code consists of the public IP variable being populated by the return of get public IP. We then, of course, print the IP address. So if we execute the Python 3 command against our s1.py you can see then that we get our message printing out, and we've been able to isolate the IP address. Having now got our public IP address, we should be able to locate that IP address based on a city or longitude and latitude. Often longitude and latitude are good for weather applications. To obtain our geolocation from the IP address, we might take a look at the ipapi.co API. You can see that I've landed on their welcome page, and they give you a simple search where we can then go through and put in an IP address, and we're returned information about that IP address. So we can see for the Google DNS server, it is indeed located in Mountain View, California. We can see its longitude and latitude. If we move out to the documentation, we've got far better documentation for the API here than we did with ifconfig.me. And they give you some good examples. We can investigate the full documentation that is shown on the left-hand side of our screen, where we can get individual fields, or we can return everything within, say, JSON or YAML format. But also we can see towards the right-hand side, we have got some tabs that we can print. If I go through and click on curl, they will then show me how I can grab the complete information using curl. We can also see that they have other programming languages there. So if we wanted to see how to return that information with Python, we can see then that we're working with our typical requests module, and then we're sending our request through to the API. Now for the moment, just for a quick demonstration, if I grab hold of the curl information, and we can then go through and copy this, and again we can see this then working from our command line. It's always good to test it from the command line before we start writing code to make sure our understanding is working properly. So if we choose then the IP address and look at it in JSON format, we get the complete information coming back. But each one of those elements is a field that we can return separately. So I could look for the city, which is Mountain View. If we wanted to grab the latitude, probably going to choose latitude because it's easier to spell, I think, than longitude. And if we go through and put in latitude, we're going to get the latitude coming back. So that gives us an idea of how we can use it with the command line. But of course, we want to implement it within our script, so we can pass the IP address through automatically from our ifconfig.me API. So if we take a look at the stage 2 PY file, we can typically ignore the top of the script now because we've seen the import request. We're not concentrating now on the get public IP address. We're more interested in our get location. So this then takes the parameter of an IP address. We build up the URL. We then populate our response from the requests of the URL. And then we populate the data variable with our response. That's going to be a multi-valued key that we can then go through and start returning. So we can look to check that latitude and longitude are both in data, and we return data latitude and data longitude. We can see then that we go through and populate the latitude and longitude variables with get location based on the public IP address, and then print those variables out. So all that is left for us to do is to execute the Python script, so Python 3, and then running S2. You can see then we're still printing out the public IP address, but we're now printing out both the latitude and the longitude relating to my IP address. And I do think we need a drum roll now as we finally get to look at retrieving our weather. We have our IP address. Our IP address has given us our location, and we can then check the weather for our location. You're probably going to be able to find many weather forecasting APIs out there on the internet, but do make sure you can find one where you don't have to charge. Charging ones might be a little bit more accurate and a little bit more flexible, but if you just want to get used to using APIs, then finding one that is free to use is probably the way to go. Here we're using openmeteo.com, and we can see that we've got the documentation open. As we start looking through, we can see different selections that we can make in our forecasting. The default is just to show you the temperature over the next 7 days. But we can go through and choose other parameters. So I'm going to set in the time zone, so just making sure that the time is set correctly. I'll leave the longitude and latitude set the way that it is, but we have the temperature. But we could also go through and include other weather data. I'm going to put in the cloud cover. And then as we go down, we can reload our chart. And we can see now that we have 2 sets of data, one showing the temperature and one showing the cloud cover. If we move up to the URL, we can see how adding those parameters is changing the URL. And that gives us an idea of how we could use it within an API application such as Python. But we could also go through and take a look at their Python implementation, and we can see that we could use this code. It's verbose. It's actually giving us hourly data here as well. But we'll go back and look at a more simple implementation just to get the idea of what's happening. So if I open up my stage 3 or s3.py file, we can jump straight down to our function, the get weather forecast, where we pass through the latitude and the longitude. We've made up the URL, and you can see within the URL, we're passing through then our longitude and latitude. As we move further into the code, we can see that we are populating our response with the request.get on our URL. We're looking to populate the data dictionary with our response in JSON format. And of course, we're checking that we've got the right data in there. So we're checking for daily, temperature, and we are returning then the daily temperature. Moving towards the bottom of the code, we're populating the max temperatures array. And that's going to be made up of our get weather forecast based on our latitude and longitude. And then, of course, we print out the next 7 days temperatures. So with that done, we can go through and see the output by executing our script. So Python 3 on S3. We're still including the public IP address and the longitude and latitude, but you can see the maximum temperatures now for the next 7 days, ranging from something like 20 degrees or 18 degrees going through to 23.7 by the looks of things. But that's the weather for Peterborough in the next 7 days. Yes, but my weather app on the phone does the same thing. And we, of course, are aware of that, but you're able to customize the result as well as learning APIs. So our main focus was to learn APIs, and we saw we could use curl and Python to access ifconfig.me, ipapi.co, openmeteo.com to build our own weather app.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @TheUrbanPenguin.